and welcome to our talk about the mightiest empire of them all, embracing not just our ports of call, not just the Mediterranean basin, but virtually all of the known Western world. In response to several requests, we will conclude this lecture by looking at not only the anatomy and physiology of empire, but why inevitably they all seem to decline and fall. So this lecture will run a bit long. So if you've got bingo scheduled for 3 o'clock, you may have to put it off just a bit. Those of you who have been kind enough to attend these lectures heretofore know that I've asked you to imagine our seaborne ship as a time machine that takes us back to when the Mediterranean Empire was truly the center of gravity, the core, the basis of civilization that we enjoy today. That the dozen or so countries it currently embraces was at one time or another under the aegis of a single peoples. And under the aegis of Rome, from roughly 200 BC to its fall in 476 AD, although it then continued on for another 800 years with its capital in Constantinople. Nowhere in recorded history has there been a colossus like the Roman Empire, outstanding for its strength, its size, its durability, its levels of achievement. At its height, the Roman Empire embraced some 4,000 cities, 2 million square miles, 20 million souls, roughly 1/5 of the Earth's population consider themselves Roman citizens. And because Rome is a master of assimilation, at its height, some very exotic peoples legitimately consider themselves Roman citizens. Rome is still with us today. A good third of the world continues to speak a Latin tongue, and indeed Latin remains undiluted in our current language. Words like status quo, gratis, decimate, barbarian, Cincinnati. The word king, Kaiser, Tsar, ZTZAR, all were derived from Caesar. That we wear our wedding ring on our left fourth finger is because the Romans considered the left fourth finger to be a direct route to the heart. And that fathers give their daughters away as brides because in Roman times the fathers owned their daughters and then they gave up ownership to their husbands. The space between railroad tracks is exactly the distance between the wheels of a Roman chariot. And I would suspect that it is no coincidence that the chief Roman god, Apollo, had his birthday on December 25th. The Romans achieved this remarkable absolute supremacy and were able to hang on to it for as long as they did for any one of a number of reasons. And as I said when we talked about some of the earlier empires, they made these achievements through the efforts of a relatively small handful of people. Today the Mediterranean basin is a crowded place, but 2 millennia ago it was by our standards relatively unpopulated. So what we're going to talk about today are the fruits of the talents of a very small group of individuals. Now, some of my best friends are Italian, but if I were asked to nominate that group for world domination, my Italian friends would not be the first individuals to spring to mind. So clearly these classic Romans were of a cut of a very special cloth. First of all, the Romans was suffused with a moral conviction that they were divinely entitled to rule the world. And their mission, every Roman's mission, was to spread Roman law and rule because it was the best way to live. The Greeks were interested in individual liberty and learning for learning's sake. The Romans were interested in dissemination of state power. And of course, the first way they did this was through absolute military supremacy. Just imagine you're a Roman enemy, and they're coming across the field of these 25 shields locked side by side with these spikes sticking out, and behind that another 25 men with these shields, and behind them another 25 men. The Romans could field extraordinarily large armies, armies which never backed down. The Romans never gave up. Yes, from time to time they would lose a battle. Hannibal in particular gave them a rough going. But if they lost a battle and 30,000 legionnaires, they'd be back next month with 60,000 legionnaires. And the second time they would win. They did not back down. Interestingly, because their military power was so absolute, this Roman infantry was sort of a combination infantry, armored division, and cavalry. They rarely had to use it. Suppose, for example, you were the governor of Croatia, at that point an independent nation or a city-state. And one day there's a knock on the door, and you open the city gates, and there's a Roman general, and he says, "Hello and congratulations. I'm here to invite you. You have an opportunity to become part of the Roman Empire." And behind him are 30,000 legionnaires with those shields and swords and spikes. You're going to say, no, thank you? You come right in. So it was rare that the Romans had to use this extraordinary power, which is why we talk about the Pax Romana. It's a very expensive proposition maintaining this military-industrial complex, but it did work, and the Romans rarely had to go to war. So military hegemony would be number one. The second quality that enabled the Romans to build this empire was their administrative prowess and their ability to assimilate or to bond to any culture. As they spread out, they would bond to the culture and convert each new province to become allies rather than enemies. The Romans ruled with an exceedingly light hand. The legions would arrive, they'd make their point, and then they would leave, and they would leave the administrative and political structure of their newly acquired territory intact. They would leave the governors and the mayors and the aldermen in place. Say in contrast to what the coalition did in Iraq, when not only did we dispose of Saddam, but we wiped out the entire governmental structure right down to the street cleaners, to our everlasting regret. The Romans wouldn't do that. The legions would arrive, they'd stay for a few weeks, make their point, and then leave with the structure intact, and requiring only three things. One, you pay your taxes to Rome on time. These are new taxes. Two, that you acknowledge the Roman gods. And three, that you acknowledge the ultimate supremacy of Rome. And if you did those three things, you were pretty much left to rule themselves. The Romans were extraordinarily tolerant of other religions. They were very religious themselves, but very respectful of other religions, and you could practice your religion. And in fact, if the Romans discovered in one of their newly acquired territories that they worshipped a god that seemed to have certain talents or gifts that their pantheon could not provide, well, the Romans would adopt that god and add them as well. The Romans never met a god they didn't like. All they asked for was reciprocity, which is why the Jews and the Christians ran into trouble, because that's the one thing that Jews and Christians couldn't do, which was to honor the pagan gods. The Romans expanded with a carrot and a stick. The stick, of course, was the Roman legions. But the carrot was, look, you become part of the Roman Empire, and yes, you're going to have to pay taxes, but this is the most prosperous place on earth. It's well administered. There's no war. standard of living. Health standards are very high. You become part of that. And as Rome expands, you get the benefit of the taxes from the new outlying areas, sort of an actual workable Ponzi scheme in a sense. So that was the carrot, and the ultimate tip of the carrot was Roman citizenship with all of the privileges. There was no more prestigious way to travel through the world than in a Roman toga. That even beat out an American Express black platinum card. If, of course, acquiescence and assimilation was not on the cards, then we had the stick. And the Romans could be very cross indeed if you resisted. As the Carthaginians found out in about 154 BC, in the Punic Wars, Rome eventually prevailed, and they killed all of the men, sold the women and children into slavery, and then wiped out the Carthaginian Empire and its culture so that it simply disappeared from history. What little we know about Carthage is through the Roman historians, and of course history is always written by the victors. Then they salted the earth, so for 2 generations nothing could grow. So you did not want to cross the Romans. They could be very ruthless. But they were exquisitely sensitive to any suggestions that they might be bullies, that they knew that the gods would punish hubris. So the Romans took great care never to appear to be militaristic or offensive in any way. And when they did go to war, it was always, at least by their lights, a defensive war. Romans would never start a war, but if they had to defend their security, well, they would do what they had to do. An example of this, also about 150, maybe 200 years BC, was the Romans became convinced that the Carthaginian island of Sardinia was preparing to mount an attack on Rome. And that, in fact, they believed the Sardinians were collecting weapons of mass destruction, javelins and chariots and swords, for this purpose. And they leveled their accusations, and the Sardinians, who were no fools, they're going to attack the Roman Empire. And no, we have no such intentions. And the Romans said, oh, yes, we know that you do, and we know that you have these weapons. And they said, no, we don't. And the Romans said, yes, you do. So the Roman Senate sent some inspectors, weapon inspectors, to check this out. And of course, they found no weapons of mass destruction and reported back to the Roman Senate. And they used the absence of these weapons as proof of the nefarious slickness of the Sardinians. Not only did they have the weapons, but they were hiding them, you see. And so, purely for defensive purposes, Rome went in and leveled Sardinia. And now Sardinia was part of the Roman Empire. So, as I say, you could rely on the Romans to guarantee peace, but you also had to mind your P's and Q's. So here we have the great Mediterranean basin. We talked about Alexander and his great empire, easily exceeded by that of Rome. After the Roman Empire, we have the Napoleonic Empire, the French Empire. But the subject today, of course, is Rome itself. I was asked the last time I lectured what these 2 little brown spots were up there in Scandinavia. Were these some advanced Roman outposts? And actually, when I was preparing these slides, 2 drops of Chianti fell on the slides. And I felt, given the nature of the lecture, I might as well just leave them there. It is said that the barbarians attacked Rome, not because they really wanted to sack it, but they had tasted Roman wines, and they thought, this is pretty good. We want to be part of that. So you see, the empire was indeed vast. Its height, it stretched from Scotland to the Sahara. It embraced the Balkans, most of Europe, much of the Middle East, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Judea, Turkey, of course, even parts of the Russian Empire, the Ukraine and Crimea, were Romanized. And in addition to its military supremacy and its remarkable administrative prowess, the Romans had several other things going for them that enabled them to make these achievements. And one of them was its extraordinary level of engineering. Roman roads, for example, and there were 6,000 miles of them, are still in place today. The Romans would dig a trench 6 feet deep. They'd fill that with gravel, then larger stones, and finally marble paving. And they were 12 feet wide. And the Romans made these roads straight. If they were encountered a hill, they wouldn't follow the goat path around the hill. They would level the hill, or they'd go through it. All Roman roads were straight because that's the way they could get the legions out to the provinces in a hurry. They were built primarily to march the soldiers, but quickly they became a principal mechanism for Roman trade, and one of the reasons why Rome was able to spread out and trade with so many vast regions in a practical way, up and down these roads. They, I think by any modern standards, were over-engineered. After all, we're talking about foot traffic here. I think it's fair to say the Romans created the first freeways. I compared them to the roads outside my town in San Anselmo, California, where every 2 years we've got potholes that have to be filled, and here we have Roman roads that have lasted for 2 millennia in the face of earthquakes and all sorts of natural disasters. So they were truly extraordinary engineers, and nowhere was these feats of engineering more apparent than in their creation of aqueducts. You remember that what limited the size of Greek cities was you didn't have enough food and water. Well, the roads got the food in, but where are you going to get water? The city of Rome itself had 1 million people, a size of a city not seen again until Shakespeare's London. They had 21 aqueducts coming in from all parts of the empire, supplying central Rome with pure water. These aqueducts, in some instances, were several hundred miles in length, and were engineered so perfectly that for every mile they would drop an inch, so the water would move by itself right into Rome, supplying the fountains, the baths, and running water in many Roman villas. They even had in the baths hot water as well as cold water. How? One of the aqueducts would empty into a room and the water would splay out over a marble floor. And underneath that marble floor was another room where there were furnaces, and charcoal and bellows, and slaves working in 120-degree heat. And they would heat that room and heat the marble, which would in turn heat the water above. And yes, much of Rome's accomplishments depended upon slaves. The Roman engineering also was responsible for a part of the empire you're not likely to see, but was perhaps as important as the aqueducts. As you may recall, one of the hazards of ancient time was diseases, and large cities produced a lot of garbage and detritus. The Romans built sewers, and these sewers would then carry the detritus away. The aqueducts would bring the water in, the sewers would carry them out, so that even these large cities all over the empire were healthy places, very healthy places. None of this, of course, would have been possible were it not for slave labor. And the Romans had very clear ethnic classifications for their slaves. Ethiopians were considered to be good bookkeepers, the Greeks good teachers and doctors. The Romans considered the British slaves to be the lowest level, not fit for anything more than janitorial work, according to Cicero. But everything depended upon slave labor. Take a small businessman, say a man who builds stoves, iron stoves, for the villas to cook their food and keep them warm in winter. And in order to mold the sheets of iron in the shape of a stove, they had to be quite hot, almost molten. And so above his foundry would be one of those rooms down below with these slaves working in 120, 130-degree heat with their bellows to create the heat necessary to mold the iron stoves. One could imagine the stove maker going home and his wife asked him, how did things go, honey? And he would say, oh, I spent the entire day stoving over a hot slave. It's just an old Roman joke. Right? It was in a highly enlightened civilization. Even a slave could eventually acquire wealth and even citizenship. Women had complete rights. It was not possible anymore for husbands to simply dispatch their wives. They had divorce. Children had rights. It was an authoritarian society, but definitely not a totalitarian one. The Romans were a deeply religious lot. They rarely took a step without checking with the gods. And as I say, they had a god for every occasion, and many religious celebrations and sacrifices to the gods, usually an animal sacrifice. But the Romans were eminently practical. They would perhaps sacrifice a goat on this altar and pyre to the gods. But then after the religious devotion, they would then eat the goat. So their religious ceremonies were a combination of devotion and a barbecue. And for the gods, they would leave all the fat, things like that. They would eat all the good parts. The gods had to make do with the chunks of fat and such. And I've often suspected that the decline of the pagan gods was less due to the rise of Christianity than their high cholesterol diet during the height of the empire. And as I indicated earlier, it didn't matter what your religious beliefs were. As long as you went along with the Roman ones, you could certainly follow your own thinking in that regard. We can divide Roman history into two parts. The Republic, which is roughly about 200 BC to the birth of Christ, and thereafter Imperial Rome. The Republic had a constitution which consisted of two executives, like two presidents. They had a one-year term, not a president and a vice president, but two presidents, and they were elected annually. An aristocratic Senate, which had most of the power, and then a more plebeian assembly. The Romans were very sensitive to the possibility of too much power ending up in the hands of one individual and in one group. So we have in ancient Rome the basis of the American Constitution and its checks and balances. Then we find the imperial period where Rome was increasingly ruled by emperors, some competent, some substantially less so. And Imperial Rome was also the time of two of the greatest generals in history. One of them, Pompey the Great. And Pompey acquired much of the Middle East for the Roman Empire, and then he was brought home to act as a kind of home guard. And 15 years his junior, the second great general, and probably, I think, the greatest general in all of history, Julius Caesar. Caesar was a brilliant, charismatic, capable, brave, and handsome man, ambitious. Probably his talent was exceeded only by his ambitions. And it was Caesar who conquered much of Western Europe for the Roman Empire. He was a remarkable orator, remarkable writer. As a general, like Alexander before him, you would always find Caesar in the heat of battle. Wherever the battle was the most intense, you would see Caesar on his white horse, his purple cape flowing, sword in hand. He was one of the boys. And if the men had a forced march on half rations, he'd march along with them on half rations. This kind of egalitarianism, this sort of personal bravery, endeared him to his men. They were intensely loyal. Any one of Caesar's men would have laid down their life for him. He was also extraordinarily charming and seductive. Many lovers. There's an old Roman ditty which went something like, Roman husbands, tie your wife's gowns down. Julius Caesar is coming to town. And apparently he was a man of such charm and personality that women too would just lay down for him. I think that Caesar combined the qualities of Bismarck, Franklin Roosevelt, Napoleon, and Churchill. I say Bismarck because of Caesar's political skills in negotiating the treacherous shoals of the late Roman Republic. I say FDR because though Caesar was of nobility, he was beloved by the people, and though, as I will explain, he came to power through a coup d'etat, if he had stood for election, I'm sure he would have won by a landslide. I compare him to Napoleon because of his strategic and tactical brilliance in the field and his recognition and the use of military strategy for political ends. And I liken him to Churchill because of his way with words. His Latin memoirs are still used in schools that teach Latin. And I would suspect that had Caesar came on the scene not at the beginning of imperial Rome, but in the 4th century when it was in deep trouble, I think Rome would have survived and we might have been spared the Dark Ages. Interestingly, Caesar almost didn't make it on this planet at all. His mother was in labor for 28 hours. And finally, fearful that he would lose both mother and child, Caesar's obstetrician, and this is evidence of how modern Roman medicine was, his obstetrician took a scalpel and the risky procedure of opening the belly of Caesar's mother and delivering Caesar that way, thereby creating the world's first cesarean. Yes. I suspect that the 28 hours Caesar spent in the womb created a certain degree of cerebral anoxia, which is why Caesar suffered from grand mal epilepsy all of his life. In any event, Caesar was growing impatient with the Roman bureaucracy. He thought the Senate corrupt, and he thought what the Roman Republic needed was a man on a white horse, a man of great talent, why a man very much like himself. And as a consequence, he committed what Rome considered to be the most heinous act of treason. The most heinous act of treason would be for a Roman general to come into Rome at the head of his army. After a great conquest, they were certainly welcome and celebrated for days, but to enter Rome with your army, of course, the Senate wisely knew would be a very dangerous thing. So that was the worst thing a Roman general could do. But Caesar, as I say, became impatient, and he brought his army to the outskirts of Rome. The boundary of Rome then was the river Rubicon. And he pondered his decision for about 15 minutes and then said to his chief of staff, Mark Antony, the die is cast. And Caesar and his armies crossed the Rubicon. In time, they were met by Pompey's armies. And though Pompey was a great general, he was getting old by this time. His men were rusty. And even though his soldiers outnumbered Caesar's 2-1, Caesar's armies prevailed. And now Caesar became the ultimate authority in Rome. But knowing how sensitive the Romans are to acquisition of power and to hubris, he never declared himself emperor or king, never wore a crown. He simply was going to be the first counsel of the Senate, sort of like the Speaker of the House or the majority whip, perhaps. And he would preside over the Senate. He punctiliously retained all of the facade of the Roman Republic, punctiliously honored the senatorial privileges. He was a very gracious and courteous man. And so we have here the trappings of a democracy, of a Roman Republic, but the power is really behind the scenes, all in Caesar's hands. And as part of that face, that saving face for the Senate, he continued to tolerate and indeed respect some of the more ornery senators who chafed under his rule, who knew what was going on behind the scenes, and who wanted the Republic restored. Like Cato, for example, a really feisty Republican in the Senate. always giving Caesar the business. Caesar was always very gracious in his responses. In fact, one day, a letter in the form of a scroll arrives while Caesar is presiding over the Senate, and a messenger delivers this message to Caesar, and he reads it, and he puts it in his toga. Cato rises, and he says, "Caesar, I demand to know the contents of that message." And Caesar says, "Cato, it's not public business, just a personal note, has nothing to do with Senate business. Caesar, you know the rules of the Senate, and any information, however obscure, any data that arrives to any member of this august body belongs to the body as a whole. I demand that you read the contents of that message." Caesar says, "Cato, it's not senatorial business. It's a personal note. I stand on the rules of the Senate." "Very well, Cato." So Caesar takes out the note, and he reads it. "It's from your sister, Cato." It reads as follows: "Dear Caesar, my lips still burn from your kisses of last night. My thighs tremble in anticipation of our," and so on and so forth. So Caesar was not without a sense of humor. Caesar, now having things seemingly going his way, he's now secure in his position, decides he's going to check out his property. So he goes on a comprehensive tour of the empire, far beyond our modest itinerary. And of course, his travels naturally take him to Egypt. And it is in Egypt that the 55-year-old Caesar meets the 22-year-old Elizabeth Taylor. Actually, Cleo looked more like this. And she was something. Not really a great beauty, but a brilliant woman, a very capable administrator. Remember, she's at the Ptolemy line from Alexander's general. She's not Egyptian. She's Greek. But a very competent ruler, the only ruler that I know at the time who took the trouble to actually learn Egyptian, and spellbinder. And so Caesar and Cleopatra become good friends, and she bears him a child, whom she names Caesarion. So it would seem that Caesar has everything going his way. He's got this empire, he's got Cleopatra, he's got a son now, an heir. But conspiracies are always brewing. And remember, Caesar is a brave man, never had a bodyguard. And the Republicans in the Senate realize the only way they can restore democracy is to eliminate Caesar. So on the Ides of March, as he's walking up the Senate steps, they approach him apparently with petitions, and a dozen of them draw their daggers and stab Caesar to death on the steps of the Senate. The last blow is struck by a young man reputed to be a son of Caesar and one of his mistresses, essentially a illegitimate son. And his name is Brutus, which is why Caesar said, "You too, Brutus," as his last words. And Caesar collapses and exsanguinates there. And vain to the last, his last act is to cover himself up with his toga so that nobody would see him die. A civil war breaks out between the young man and nephew designated in Caesar's will as his heir by name of Octavius, a will that, by the way, Antony tried to suppress. Antony, of course, sees himself as Caesar's heir, and their armies clash. Neither makes much headway. They make a truce, and Antony is given the eastern half of the empire, which includes Egypt, and Octavius is going to take Western Europe. They divvy that up. Egypt is the breadbasket, and perhaps the Western Europe more of the cultural center. We have many pictures of Octavius. They're everybody except the chap in the your lower right corner. And I'll tell you why in a minute. That fellow is Antony. The rest are Octavius. Antony goes off to Egypt, where, of course, he too meets Elizabeth Taylor. They too become good friends, and Cleopatra bears Antony 2 children. But to Rome's dismay, Antony becomes Egyptianized under Cleopatra's seductive spell. He starts wearing Egyptian clothing and makeup. He has talks about making her his queen, which doesn't go down well in Rome at all, and particularly doesn't go down with Octavius, because Antony is married to Octavius's sister, Octavia. And then he commits the ultimate sin. He has a coin made in his image. And that is the ultimate evidence of blatant grasping for power and glory. It's the final straw. And Octavius gathers together an army and a navy. Antony's a little rusty, but he and Cleopatra do the best they can to defend their position. They lose. And Antony commits another Roman sin. He commits suicide, which you won't find many images of him surviving, as does Cleopatra. And Octavius now is supreme ruler of the empire. He assures now 16-year-old son of Caesar and Cleopatra, Caesarion, that he'll be perfectly safe. So Caesarion comes back. He's immediately assassinated because Octavius sees this young man with Caesar's blood as a threat. But interestingly, he allows the 2 children of Antony and Cleopatra to survive. In fact, takes them back to Rome, and they're raised by some family members and disappear from the pages of history. Octavius is now the first of a long line of emperors. To honor his new position, his name is changed to Augustus, sort of father of his country. And like Caesar before him, the Senate honors him by naming a month, a calendar month, after him, the month of August. And the month that had been named after Julius Caesar was July. He is firmly in place, but like Caesar, also observes punctiliously the Senate. We still have the form, if not the function, of a democratic republic. But now Rome is launched on its imperial history. We have a succession of emperors, some enormously gifted, like Marcus Aurelius and Augustus himself, some like Tiberius, mediocre, some incompetent, and some like Caligula and Nero, certifiably insane. We don't have time to go into Nero's unique approach to civic redevelopment. But after he leveled Rome in the fire, he then built a huge palace with an artificial lake to take its place. And when he was assassinated, the palace was buried by what became the Roman Colosseum. So Rome didn't so much eliminate history as just build on top of it. So now we have the imperial period. It is probably the period of greatest achievement, and a Rome that I think if we were living there today, we would recognize. And I think it's testimony to the strength of the structure that it could survive emperors like Caligula and Nero. Well, what was it to live in Rome? What did they have? They had things that we take for granted today. There's a contemporaneous author, Juvenal, who describes a day in the life of a Roman family. And I'm quoting pretty verbatim from memory. This Roman businessman comes back after a day at work, and he enters his villa. And his wife says, "How did it go?" And he said, "Well, it went well, but good God, the traffic in Rome. 20 years ago, I could have made it in 20 minutes. Now it takes my chariot an hour and a half. And the pollution, the manure in the streets, and the dust. I wish we could go back to the good old days, you know." And she says to him, "You think you had a problem?" Well, the slave ran away. The servants quit. I've got 2 tickets to the Colosseum tonight and nobody to babysit young Lucian. So, very familiar to us all. The Romans had everything that we have today and then some. They had tremendous entertainment in the Colosseum, and there were colosseums or amphitheaters in every Roman province. Regularly several gladiators and countless tigers and lions were killed. But they had other kinds of entertainment, like, for example, house afire, where slaves would build this wooden house with furniture in it and go inside. And then the Romans would set it on fire, and the slaves would try to escape with the furniture, and the ones who got out would have their freedom. So it was sort of reality television that the Romans invented. They had business contracts. They had banks. They had toxic mortgages. They had bankruptcy. And bankruptcy in Rome was a bit more serious business than it is now, where if you went bankrupt, if you didn't pay your creditors in 30 days, they would take all your property and you would be sold into slavery. They had shopping malls and dry cleaners. You had to keep those togas clean. They had fast foods. They had marriage and divorce, and people married for love, they married for money, they were divorced for the same reasons. They had ticket bureaus, ticket scalpers. They had terrorist problems, primarily pilots. They had immigration issues. Should we assimilate all these folks who want to become part of the empire and grow the empire, or should we keep them out and keep Rome pure? Constant battle. They had elections, senatorial elections, and limits on how much each senate could spend, how many banquets he could have. They had an upper class and a middle class. They had a military-industrial complex. They had pensions. They had retirement homes. They had old-age pensions for the veterans. They had an enormous tourist industry with Michelin-like books that would give 1, 2, or 3 stars to inns and restaurants along the way. And Roman tourists would regularly follow the same itinerary that we're enjoying on Spirit this week. So there was very little that the Romans enjoyed that we don't enjoy today, and vice versa. Interestingly, the Romans were also dependent, tremendously dependent, upon foreign oil, olive oil, and foreign grain. And in order to make sure that those supplies of oil and grain flowed into Rome, they had to keep these Roman legions stationed there. So again, you see the importance of commerce and the military hegemony and how the two were woven together. The Romans were tough, rather humorless, rather dour, very muscular, serious people, very religious. Their women tended to be softer and rounder. They exercised regularly. They wore lots of makeup. One Roman man was heard to complain he had never seen his wife's face since the wedding because of all the makeup that she wore. And they dined very well. They had dining rooms in their villas, and their villas were extraordinary. Their walls were impregnated with mosaics. Perhaps you've seen them in what's the Vesuvius town that was covered up with Pompeii and Herculaneum, thank you. Tapestries, alabaster pillars, marvelous furniture and jewels. They needed slaves to guard this treasure, and then more slaves to guard the first slaves. Their dining was sumptuous, but usually just an evening meal. A Roman businessman would start his day at 7. He'd see some clients for a couple of hours, then do a little paperwork, then maybe break for a light lunch, a Caesar salad perhaps. Then back to the office, breaking for an early dinner, and depending on how wealthy you were, your dinner would get later and later, maybe broken up with a couple of hours at the Roman baths. And their delicacies included such things as the flamingo wings and the tongues of doves, very exotic cooking, wines from all over southern Europe. One famous saying that I got off a Roman coin in Latin, vomut ut et ut vomut, which roughly translates eat and vomit, vomit and eat. So after they had this wonderful meal, they wanted to do it again, so they'd go out in their vomitorium, give it up, and then start all over again. Well, clearly, the Romans had it all together. And they didn't much care what other people thought of them because they didn't have to. From their perspective, they had absolute power, and every Roman citizen thought Rome imperishable. And why not? A Roman could set out from central Rome and walk in any direction, north, south, east, and west, for months, and still be part of the Roman Empire, with all of the luxuries and privilege attendant to it. So how could they possibly think in terms of it might not be there anymore? But that's, of course, not what happened. And in 476 AD, 1,200 years before the founding of the United States of America, Rome was definitively sacked, and we consider that the end of the Roman Empire in the West. It was the barbarians that did it. Whoop, hit the wrong one here. And none more notorious than Attila. Attila the Hun. We don't know much about his origins, somewhere from Asia, but fierce fighters. They had no property. They lived on their horses. That was their property. They lived on their horses. They ate. They slept. They probably engaged in other activities on their horses. They needed no temples and no villas, no bureaucracy, no senate. They could move with such swiftness that they would have leveled a province before the Roman legions could even get going. So they were an enormously effective military force. And they're called a barbarian. Attila was a very bright man, and perhaps he didn't speak, couldn't write Greek or Latin, I don't know, but he certainly was articulate. There are some sayings that have come down from him, including my favorite, which is, never make an enemy except on purpose. You know, this is a bright man. And he was just one of a number of barbarian hordes that the Romans had to contend with. And in 452 AD, Attila and his hordes arrived at the gates of Rome. And there were no Roman legions to protect Rome. They were all spread out guarding the frontiers, which by now were enormous. But Rome had one secret weapon, Pope Leo. By now, Rome had been Christianized, and the Pope rides out alone to meet Attila. And he confers with Attila for 45 minutes. And we don't know what he said, but Attila turns around and does not sack Rome. We could use the Pope's diplomacy, I think, today in the Middle East. I have a feeling Attila wasn't done. He probably was planning to finish the job, come back in the next season. But in any event, he goes off. And whatever plans he did have to come back and sack Rome were never actualized because Attila, on his 55th birthday, marries an 18-year-old girl. This reminds me of this joke about this 80-year-old man who's going to marry an 18-year-old girl. So he goes to his doctor for a premarital checkup, and the doctor says, Sam, you're in pretty good shape, but you're 80, she's 18. The honeymoon could be fatal. Sam says, well, look, if she dies, she dies. Well, it didn't work out that way for Attila. They have this wedding feast, and then Attila retires to his tent with his 18-year-old bride, and the next morning she wakes up and Attila is on the bed next to her, dead. And it's so often the case with charismatic men, his sons didn't have the old man's stuff. And the Huns at that point fade from history. As I say, they left nothing behind, so we know little about them. What they left was just bits of charcoal, the remnants of the towns and villages that they had razed to the ground. But Rome was certainly not secure. Other barbarians came and sooner or later sacked Rome repeatedly. until the empire was no more. There was no longer any infrastructure. Without the Roman legions to protect the land, it became overrun by barbarians and brigands, so trade was impossible. Without the Roman navy, the sea lanes were no longer safe from pirates, so world trade collapsed. The standard of living fell. With that, life expectancy fell. Typical Roman at the height of the empire could live to be 75, 80 years of age. Within 100 years, people were back down to expectancies of 35 and 40. No more modern medicine, no more fire brigades, no more libraries. People forgot how to write. People forgot how to swim. People were drowning. People were no longer living in villas but in hovels. It all went away. Well, how is that possible? How is it that a society that seemed to have it all could, in the space of a single generation, virtually disappear? Well, there are a number of explanations. First, there's something inherent in empires and being a superpower, where if you are a superpower, you know that there's nobody who can stand up against you. You're always going to win. And that creates tremendous temptation to be aggressive and to launch perhaps gratuitous wars because you know you will prevail. But you see, defending against a superpower, though you inevitably lose, and it's no joy to lose a war, it doesn't cost you very much. Your lands are being defended. The superpower has these long supply lines. It has to bring all these legions in and then occupy you for who knows how long. So being a superpower and winning is expensive, and you can lose through winning. Obviously, there was no way that Czechoslovakia was going to attack Hitler's empire in 1938, or little Denmark was going to attack Germany. But Czech Republic and Slovakia and Denmark is still here. Hitler's empire is gone. So there's a built-in inherent price in being a superpower. And granted, you get tremendous technological superiority, but it's not very profitable. It costs, I think, $200,000 to build a 500-pound bunker-busting bomb. But after you use it, what do you have but a hole? So military technology is very costly, and Rome, as in other empires, were reluctant to tax its people to an extent to support its ambitions. So Rome was always running out of money, and we see this in other empires. Philip II, even with the gold from South America, was constantly going bankrupt in his efforts to maintain the Spanish Empire. So empires, by their very nature, always overreach. And their enemies, though puny, often will prevail just by staying on their feet. George Washington knew he could not defeat the greatest army in the world, the British Army of George II. He knew, though, if he could keep his continental army together, eventually it would just get too expensive for Britain. And the Americans won a few battles, but mostly it was Parliament who pulled the plug. So empires tend to overreach, as Napoleon, who had everything going for him, discovered when he took on the Russian winter. A second factor is what I would call a political Peter principle. You know the Peter principle from business, where a salesman is the best salesman in his division, so they promote him to sales manager, and he does even better there. Higher salary, longer hours, but he does very well. He knows the product, he knows salesmen and sales, so they now promote him to be vice president. They send him off to the home office in New York, and now he's not dealing with product or salesmen, he's dealing with other vice presidents, and he's behind his computer screen all day. This is not his strength, and he does poorly, and he's fired. He was promoted to his level of incompetence. And I think we see in empires, and particularly the Roman Empire, its very success eventually got it to expand to the point where it could no longer manage itself. So many of the legionnaires were now protecting this ever larger frontier. It was very hard to get together a 300,000 man army anymore. Furthermore, it was spread out so thin that increasingly the legions depended upon ethnic groups in the frontiers themselves, so that more and more the legions were becoming membered by individuals that resembled the people they were guarding against, people who would never see Rome, probably didn't speak Latin, and had divided loyalties. So the legions were not what they once were. There are some who feel that it was Rome's moral decadence, that it decayed, it rotted from within, making it vulnerable to attacks. But the Hollywood version of Rome's decadence was long in the past. By now, Rome was Christianized. It was a very moral place. The pagan gods were gone. If you were a pagan, you could no longer practice law, practice medicine. You were discriminated against. Now the Christians had the upper hand. I'm sure the pagans were thinking, where are those lions now that we need them? So it was a very moral place. Moral decadence probably would not fly as an explanation. Now Gibbon, in his magisterial 6 volumes, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, lays the blame at the feet of Christianity. It was his point that a Roman pagan facing a crisis would draw his sword, a Roman Christian would turn the other cheek. And this might guarantee him a place in heaven, but would be less serviceable in facing a crisis here on earth. And finally, there is the very nature of empire success, which tends to breed luxury. To be a successful imperial empire, you have to be strong and Spartan and build this empire. But then you have all this wealth and these wonderful meals and these baths and these colosseums. You tend to get soft and luxurious, and you no longer have the fiber to maintain an empire. So that built into the empire is the seeds of its own destruction. In any event, I think it likely that all of these explanations probably carry some weight. Just like a commercial airliner that has so much redundancy built into it, you have to have 4 or 5 different things go wrong for a commercial airliner to come down. And I think Rome had 4 or 5 things working against it, and they finally all came together in about 476. And so it came to an end. Perhaps all organic entities have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a natural history to everything. But imagine if you came home from this cruise and you found that your town or your village was crumbling, that grass was now growing in the streets, that there was no longer a police or fire brigades. You turned the water faucet, no water, there was no electricity, no trains, no airplanes, no banks, no mortgages, no telephones, no businesses, no doctors, no hospitals, that everything was crumbling away. And so it was with Rome. This extraordinary, seemingly imperishable, luminous empire, a time of enlightenment, a fascination with science, of discovery, of culture, of great literary and military and scientific achievement. All of this disappeared. And all over Europe, one by one, the lamps went out. They would not be relit for 1,000 years. The Dark Ages had begun. And on that rather somber note, I'm Dr. Martin Blinder, and I want to thank you, and particularly Seaborn, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my passion for this extraordinary historical part of the world. Thank you so much. I'm told we do have this time a few minutes for questions. You're all so morose, you probably can't. Yes, I can't see you through the light, so just speak up.
Where did Rome draw its slave ports from?
Where did the Roman slaves come from? They came from wherever Rome conquered and they met resistance. Pretty much. some people became slaves because they went into debt, so that they were Romans, but they didn't pay their bills, and so they were sold into slavery. But usually, if there was a battle, one of the consequences of battle would be the importation of fresh slaves. Yes?
How did one certify himself as a Roman? Was there sort of a passport issue if one became?
How could one be certified as a Roman? Did they have passports? A very good question, because anybody could become a Roman citizen. Many of the Roman emperors, for example, were not Roman. Some of the best emperors, Trajan, for example, I believe, came from Spain. So you probably had to achieve a certain level of wealth and education. Marriage to the right person would probably help, because it certainly was royal lineage. So blood was a factor. But becoming a learned and wealthy man would be enough, even in one generation, and certainly in two. Maybe the slave would not become a Roman citizen, but if he raised his children correctly, they went to the right schools, wore the right clothing, and were properly politically connected, a slave's children could become Roman citizens. So that was the carrot that I think enabled the Romans to be so successful and such remarkable assimilators. Yes, sir?
Hadrian goes all the way up and he builds a wall in northern England. Who's in charge in Rome when he's away? And if we think about communication today as being almost instantaneous, but he's a long way away from his headquarters, so to speak. Who's running the place?
Who's running Rome when Hadrian is in Great Britain building his wall, is the question. And the remarkable thing about Rome is that it had a powerful and effective bureaucracy. Certainly the Roman emperor had to sign on to major decisions, like which province are we going to absorb, and where are we going to build another Colosseum, or are we going to be pagan, or are we going to be Christian. The emperor made the big decisions, but he had a very effective bureaucracy that remained like a civil service in many Western democracies. The president or the prime minister comes and goes, the civil servants stay forever. So they tended to administer the empire very effectively. And they did so with a fraction of the administrators that we use today with all of our technological tools. The Roman administrators were few in number but extremely competent. And I think that is why Rome was able to survive some horrendous emperors. Now, that said, I should have perhaps mentioned one of the factors that I think, not historians particularly, but this guy, thinks explain Rome's decline and ultimate fall, is that it lacked a constitutional means of succession. Hadrian was a very good emperor, but suppose he wasn't. There's no way to throw the bum out. We may have some terrible administrators or leaders in, say, the United States for 4 years, for 8 years, but eventually we get to throw the bums out. The Romans could not do that. You were emperor for life, so the only means of succession was assassination. And in the last 50 years of the empire, there were 37 emperors, 25 of whom met violent deaths. And this is a hugely destabilizing way of changing government. So I think the lack of the suppleness that we see in democracies was one of the factors why Rome decayed and declined so rapidly. And eventually, these constitutional problems exceeded even its administrative competence and its remarkable military sensibilities. Yes, sir.
Talk about the decline of Rome. One of the factors that I'm interested to know how much the factor was the division of the empire into Eastern and Western Empire by Constantine.
The question is, okay, Rome fell in 476, but what's going on in the Eastern Empire where its center is Constantinople? And indeed, it's true. This is something of an ethnocentric lecture because we haven't gone to Turkey, so I simply we're covering 3 millennium of history. We had to leave a few things out. But Rome continued with a lot of its administrative and governmental and cultural achievements intact throughout the eastern half of Europe, with its center in Constantinople. Constantine occasionally would venture into Western Europe and try to restore the old Roman Empire. Several other emperors did, and they had moderate temporary success. But for the most part, the center of power and wealth and culture shifted to Constantinople, and it continued until the invasion of the Ottomans and the replacement of Constantinople by Istanbul and the Turkish Empire. But we'll have to save that for another time and another cruise. Like empires, all lecture series have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we've reached the end of mine. Thanks a lot.